Welcome to what will be, if all goes according to plan, the penultimate installment in this series of video lectures in this series or this playlist that's called Westward Expansion. I've had uh, I've had some commenters on previous videos question that overall title, pointing out that it is problematic, especially considering the people who were expanded over, and I acknowledge that. I acknowledge that wholeheartedly. My explanation to them was that this started off as basically supplements for a class that I'm teaching that already existed before I taught it. In fact, I took it as an undergrad at the same institution 20 some years ago. So, got to stick with the name of the class, but also it really is kind of a detailed explanation or examination, perhaps is a better word, of that expansion from the East Coast westward of the United States. But it's doing so, and it's been my effort to do so without losing sight of that problematic nature that some people have pointed out, and without losing sight of the various different people who were involved, many, not necessarily willingly, and who did not wind up being a part of the tapestry as presented to the American public and to the popular imagination and memory over the years. A lot of those folks have been completely neglected in past decades, just in whole groups. And it's good that that has started to change, but there's still a lot of work to be done in that department. But there is no denying that if we're looking at westward expansion by the 1890s, there was no more westward to expand to, because manifest destiny had become manifest by the 1890s, in that there was quote unquote settlement from coast to coast of the continental United States. Now, I put that word settlement in sort of air quotes because it is important to bear in mind that all these areas were settled by human beings for thousands of years before this process that we are describing. Anyhow, so if you're looking at settlement in terms of U.S. citizens, and remember, we've talked about this, I think, in a previous lecture, Native American Indians were not considered U.S. citizens until 1924. But if you look at in the context of U.S. citizens in the 19th century, there was no region in the continental United States where there were no U.S. citizens living. Now, there were plenty of regions, you can see them on the map there in the West, where there weren't very many, but there were some. So there was no specific line that you could point to and say, this is the frontier with civilization spreading behind it progressively as it was framed at the time and for many years afterward. And then here, west of that frontier is the unsettled lands. That was no longer the case. So let's take a look once more at this individual that we keep coming back to, Frederick Jackson Turner, and his frontier thesis, part of a paper delivered at a conference in 1893 that would become extraordinarily influential, immediately extraordinarily influential, and would remain so for a century roughly, and still is in the popular imagination in many ways. So his thesis was essentially, if you boil it down, that that American democracy, because this was the approach that he took, the development of American democracy and what made the American character, the American experiment, the American democracy different from Europe was the fact that from the very beginning of the colonizing process, the English colonists could always move further westward and get essentially free land if they could, remove the people who were already on it. So let's not lose sight of that. But that the American character was built by generations of this struggle of ever moving westward, claiming more land, claiming better opportunities for yourself and your family, and in so doing, in Turner's from Turner's perspective, developing this unique sort of democracy, moving from Jeffersonian democracy to Jacksonian democracy, which is a more populist, less sort of hinged on aristocracy type of American democracy. And some would say also developing this toughness of American character, this independence. And that was echoing things that at that time were already being said and had already been said by Teddy Roosevelt, who had started writing his series of historical works, The Winning of the West, started writing them in 1888, worked on them for many years. And as we've discussed before about Teddy, he maintained that the American character should be defined by ruggedness, individuality, independence that's gained by testing yourself against nature and by this westward expansion. And bear in mind, when folks from this time period talk about testing yourself against nature, they're including the indigenous people as part of nature, not as part of the people part. So anyhow, as you are aware, if you know much at all about Teddy Roosevelt, he embodied these concepts quite intentionally, or at least he tried to. So this this idea of Americanness, that's what this comes down to, comes from continuous westward movement, and as Roosevelt put it, the winning of the West, as it's also put, the taming of the West, meaning the people already there, not just the Native American Indians, but also the people of Mexican descent and nature itself. So, like I said, very influential for a long time. Here's another writer who came along decades later. This guy, Walter Prescott Webb, who wrote a book in 1931 called The Great Plains. That was the story of how the settlers conquered the plains, the region itself. And part of his argument, part of Webb's argument, was that it was also through the use of not just grit, but also the use of technology, several technological advancements from the railroad to the six-gun to barbed wire, which gave the settlers the leg up to defeat the indigenous inhabitants and also to essentially defeat the land itself and conquer and control it. This guy Webb also wrote a very influential history of the Texas Rangers that is it's good so far as it has a lot of detail, but at the same time it leaves out a lot of detail, and we'll see what I mean by that in a while. But essentially, what Webb was doing, describing, and what Roosevelt and Turner had done before was this weaving this narrative of progression. So a narrative of progression, moving forward, progress, which calls back to this painting that we have also looked at before, probably more than once, American Progress. I think the painting was made in 1873. The beautiful fair-haired maiden representing America, moving westward with everything illuminated in her wake and everything dark before her, but starting to brighten up as she approaches. So that idea that the movement west was progress and that it was enlightening to the benighted creatures who lived out there, like Indians and Mexicans, is the implication. And that it was the mark of actual true civilization, and everything outside of that was savagery, according to the dominant perspective of the time, savagery that needed to be tamed. Now, gradually, historians started to look at other things that helped shape the quote-unquote American character, helped shape the country, that were either only touched on and certainly not looked at in detail as serious factors. Things like slavery and race. Now, Turner had addressed slavery in the context of how it fit in with westward expansion, and we've talked about that. You know, the Southerners needed, they thought, to expand westward to get more slave territories so that they could expand their cotton empire. So he addressed that, but he didn't address racial attitudes, didn't address women very much either, didn't address various groups of people, from Native Americans to Mexican Americans, other than how they fit in with impeding or helping the general progress of the Europeanized European settlers. Okay, so one of the first people who really looked deeply at this other approach was Winthrop Jordan. Wrote a book in the 1960s that became very influential called White Over Black, in which he argued that from the colonial time forward, that quote-unquote Americans defined themselves in opposition racially to the people that they had enslaved and to the people whose land they had taken. So that there's an element of struggle there, struggling to subdue these racial or national groups that stood in the way, and that part of that process helped to develop the sense of self that colonists and later citizens of the United States would have from the context, from the perspective of the dominant majority. Now, after this, there were a lot of people looking at race as a factor, primarily the black-white binary, but sometimes, starting in the 1990s especially, looking also at the American Indian factor. But Jordan was not the first person to have done this. In fact, a lot of the things that he was describing in an academic setting were already being described and had already been reached as conclusions by the very prominent and noteworthy African American novelist James Baldwin, particularly. Well, he hadn't written Price of the Ticket yet. That would come in the 80s, but he said a lot of the things that that Jordan was also saying. And half a century earlier, W.E.B. Du Bois, the early civil rights leader, early 20th century, and sociologist, particularly in his dissertation, which became the 1930s book, Black Reconstruction. So what I'm saying is that this is an element, race and racial issues that was just totally ignored, pretty much, by Frederick Jackson Turner and everybody else for decades. The everybody else being mostly white folks, to be blunt about it, because Du Bois was looking at it in the early 1900s. In the late 70s, and especially throughout the 1980s into the early 90s, there was a new movement called the New Western History that some people described as revisionist history, and usually they were not being complimentary when they put it that way. But the New West, which probably no one is more associated with than Patricia Limerick, whose work, The Legacy of Conquest, essentially tackled Frederick Jackson Turner head on by name. Essentially, with the New West, there was a transition, A, toward looking at those marginalized groups of people and looking at things from their perspective, B, a de-romanticizing of the West and an effort to look at events as they actually unfolded, and C, a movement away from Turner's approach of looking at the West as a process, but rather looking at the West as a geographic place, so that Western history would simply be the history of areas that are west of the Mississippi River, and it would not include a lot of the stuff that we've talked about, the first third of this class, essentially, the colonial and early Republican period. To my mind, I prefer the term frontier studies over Western studies. And that's not just me. A lot of other folks do as well. Anyway, this has led to a large turn in how the West was approached by scholars, and it has continued into the 21st century. But going back to the era of Walter Prescott Webb, there were individuals who were looking at the West from a different lens that were academics and scholars, but not necessarily historians, who actually were more of the science variety of academics. People like Frederick Clements, who was from Nebraska, born in Nebraska, and was a professor at the University of Nebraska, who was a botanist, essentially, but whose writings and research led him to develop the concept of plant progression, that essentially an environment is kind of structured over time, depending on the climate and other factors that are going to lead it to its kind of apex or maximum form, beyond which you can't tinker with it because it has reached the form that works in that environment. And a little later on, Paul Sears, who was roughly 20 years behind, not behind intellectually, but 20 years younger than Clements. Paul Sears, who taught at the University of Oklahoma, particularly in the 1930s, was writing about the Dust Bowl, which we addressed in some detail when we were talking about land policy about 10 lectures ago. And the title says it all, that well, there were people before him back in the 1870s and 80s that talked about the desertification of the West. Essentially, instead of a narrative of progression, some of these folks were offering a narrative of declension, which is not the Turner Webb approach of settlers coming in and conquering and taming the land and transforming it into a paradise, but rather settlers coming in, finding a paradise, and basically destroying it with their approaches. Sears started calling for people to pay more attention to what Clements and others had said and to take a more scientific approach to soil and climate and stuff like that. Anyhow, it is a complex set of issues and a set of different approaches to those issues. But let's look a little more closely at Turner and where he was in 1893, by which I don't mean the city of Chicago, but by which I mean, where he was sort of intellectually coming from. This idea of the frontier was settled, quote unquote, now that he ascribed to the settlers, the waves of settlers ever expanding westward, but now having reached the Pacific Ocean and starting to have filled in the chinks in between, no longer had a west to expand into. So at the time, he was saying, this is the end of part one of American history, and now we got to figure out what part two is. Here is a map showing the settlement of the country, so far as, again, U.S. citizens are concerned. And you can see it's pretty sparse there in the West, but there were still people, non-indigenous people there, citizens there. And, that westward movement of those settlers was accelerated, obviously, by the Homestead Act that was passed during the Civil War that made it possible to get out there and get public lands, even if you had practically nothing to your name, as long as you could scrape up $5 or whatever it was to make a claim at the claims office. Also sped up by the Dawes Act that we've talked about in detail, that divided indigenous peoples' lands up into individual lots, distributing them to native families, but then opening the rest up to quote unquote settlement. Now, here's an aspect of that settlement and that westward movement that I don't know that I have really talked about previously. Maybe I have in this lecture series. It gets left out again a lot and was really left out of Turner's narrative and narratives throughout the triumphalist narratives throughout most of the 20th century. And that was the black experience of settlers and pioneers, particularly toward the end of Reconstruction, when large numbers of African Americans migrated westward from the South, former slaves and their children who were born free, that were leaving the land that they had known to try to find something different and better, especially as Reconstruction ended, because that was the beginning of what's known as the nadir or nadir of African American history, when those federal troops were withdrawn at the end of Reconstruction, and it was essentially open season on African Americans in the South. There on the bottom right, that's a guy named Pap Singleton, former runaway slave who had, from Nashville originally, the Nashville area, who had become pretty successful as a land speculator, and he started organizing wagon trains west to stake claims from, making use of the Homestead Act. And large numbers of African Americans would go on these wagon trains out to Kansas and later to Indian Territory in Oklahoma, initially to Kansas, where they, in many cases, made their own communities, communities that started off being comprised completely of African American people, many, if not most of them, former slaves. Like Nicodemus, Kansas is one example. So there have actually been, well, let me first back up and talk about this word exodusters. That's what they called themselves. That has a couple of different elements to it. Number one, you're raising dust because you're in a wagon train moving west. Number two, you're on an exodus. And, if you paid attention in Sunday school, you know what the exodus was in the Bible. It was when all those former slaves, the Israelites, left the land of their enslavement, Egypt, and headed toward a promised land. So a little play on words there, exodusters. That is something that has been addressed in popular culture, really not at all, hardly, in the first half of the 20th century. In fact, you were about two-thirds to three-quarters of the way through the 20th century before you started seeing this addressed very often. Well, you never saw it addressed often on film. One example from the early 70s is the film on the left there, Buck and the Preacher, with Buck being portrayed by Sidney Poitier there on the right, and the preacher by Harry Belafonte, not really a preacher at all, more of a con artist and gambler. And they were part of this Westward movement. And then about 20 years later, Sidney Poitier was in another film about that African American exoduster movement called initially Children of the Dust, renamed on re-release because I guess maybe some people didn't hear that first name and think of it as being a Western. Also a pretty good film, but it doesn't reach the heights of Buck and the Preacher, which I saw in theaters when I was 5 years old, and I had not seen black cowboys before on the screen. You didn't really see that in Gunsmoke or Bonanza back then. And I remember going home and taking some of my toy cowboys and changing their skin color to dark brown so that I could have some of those really cool black cowboys as part of my storytelling endeavors in my 5-year-old self. And I think that may have had an even bigger impact on me, that film, because, as an adult, a lot of my fiction, my Western fiction, has centered on the African American experience in the West, as well as also the indigenous experience, although not exclusively those things. But I've written quite a bit about that. Now, looking at this in the terms of the shrinking and disappearance of the frontier, and it being essentially by the 1890 census over, as Turner put it, that's leaving something out. Now, it's true that the contiguous United States was settled, but not necessarily the whole continental United States, because what are we leaving out? Alaska, way up to the north, which by the time of Frederick Jackson Turner had been a U.S. possession for about a quarter of a century, having been bought from the Russians. And there were a handful of U.S. citizens that moved up there in what was initially referred to as Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox, Seward being the Secretary of State who negotiated the deal to get Alaska. But then all of a sudden, people looked at it a bit differently in 1896 and early 1897 when gold was discovered in the Klondike area, which is not in Alaska, it's in the Yukon Territory in Canada. We're basically talking about everything that's sort of like south of Dawson City, you can see there in the map, which is located right where the Yukon and Klondike rivers come together. So essentially this area. And to get there, a lot of U.S. potential gold millionaires, they thought. You could go overland, but it's a lot easier to go by water. And if you took this route that goes through the through Alaska, you could actually travel by water the whole way to Dawson. You could leave by ship in Seattle and come over there and make that landing on the coast of Alaska, right at the mouth of the Yukon, where the Yukon empties into the ocean, and then go up the Yukon River all the way to the Klondike. So all of a sudden, whole lot of people coming through Alaska and headed north into this somewhat chilly environment in search of gold, which that gold rush, the Klondike gold rush, depending on how you look at it, lasted from late 1896. Some people say until 1899, which is when gold was discovered also in Alaska proper, near Nome, and then a lot of people started coming to Alaska instead of just going through Alaska to get to the Klondike. But either way you look at it, it's the same region, right? The same region of the continent. You had a whole lot of people coming up there hoping to get rich, but there were not, just like in San Francisco when that gold rush happened, there was not a whole lot of infrastructure there, physically or also socially. So there was plenty of opportunity for the type of wide open settlements that had previously existed 20 years earlier in cattle towns and mining towns in the American Midwest and Southwest. And here you can see people moving up Chilkoot Pass, which is a way to get through the Rocky Mountains, kind of a little bit more accessible than other spots to get to the Klondike. And here you can see some miners there hoping to strike it rich. One of whom was a young writer named Jack London, a young American writer, who might not have become a gold millionaire, but he did strike pay dirt with his things that he wrote, his fiction about the Klondike, the Yukon Territory, and Alaska, particularly Call of the Wild, White Fang, To Build a Fire, which is one of the best short stories ever written, in my opinion. All these things have been staples in high school English curricula and college, and also have been the basis of many successful films. Here's somebody else that came from the United States, actually from the West, to the Klondike to get rich, but not by working. His name was Jefferson Smith, but everyone knew him as Soapy Smith for reasons I'll get into in just a moment. Soapy Smith was the most notorious con artist in the American West. He had started off as a young man in Texas and had wound up in Colorado for a while, where he had a very successful operation in Denver for some time until he was run out. Some of the things that he did were standard kind of con artist tricks that were used often back then, such as the shell game, which is where the person performing the trick has 3 empty shells and usually a pea that is placed underneath one of the shells, and then he just sort of scoots those shells all around back and forth, and the person playing the game, the customer or the mark, if you will, is watching closely and betting on whether or not he can pick the correct shell when the person doing it is finished, and have it be the one with the pea. Now, the fact is that this was all a scam. It was a trick through sleight of hand. The person performing this trick would make sure that none of the shells had a pea under them after it was initially shown that the pea was there. So that might make you wonder why would anyone play this game? If people knew that it was a scam. And what would often happen is that the person doing the shell game would have an accomplice who would talk with the mark or the customer and convince them that he knew how the trick worked and advise him on how to win it, and then he'd lose, of course. Also, a game called Three Card Monte, which is where you have three playing cards, and one of them is a face card, usually a queen, and they're turned face down, and the same thing as the shell game. They're all switched all around, and then the mark bets on whether they can guess which card is the queen, and of course it's all a trick, and he's not going to be able to find that queen. However, Smith had a trick that was uniquely his own, which is what he became famous for, and that was the prize soap. He would have bars of soap wrapped in paper that he would sell, and he would make it known that there was a prize in one of the bars. One of the people that bought one of these bars of soap is going to open up that wrapper, and there's money inside. So it's kind of like a lottery, except that, again, it's a scam. With sleight of hand, the person performing the trick, in this case Soapy Smith, would make sure that he had some accomplices in the crowd and make sure that they're the ones that got the soap with the money. Everyone else paid for a bar of soap, actually. So they at least got a bar of soap out of it, but it was usually a pretty expensive bar of soap. So in addition to these scams, Soapy in Denver wound up with initially like a small army of con artists working for him, giving him a cut, and he had them organized, and before long he had made enough money, particularly through the soap trick, that he was able to bribe city officials to look the other way at concerning what he was doing, and eventually was able to have quite a bit of influence among corrupt politicians and peace officers there in and around Denver, until he didn't anymore. So he wound up leaving Denver, and there was a gold strike in the Klondike, and so he just headed up there and started over again, opened a saloon, and before long, essentially pretty much controlled the town of Skagway. Again, he had an army of con artists working for him, pulling all kinds of scams on the many people who were passing through on the way to the gold fields, until finally in 1898, on July the 8th, a group of vigilantes had formed to discuss doing something about Soapy Smith and his crew. And Smith, I said he was a con artist, and that's principally what he was, but he had become like a crime boss as well by this time. So this group of vigilantes met on a wharf to have a meeting to decide what to do about Soapy Smith, and he heard about it, so he showed up and tried to essentially crash the party. But there were 4 guards posted that wouldn't let him past to get over to disrupt the vigilante group, and he got in a scuffle with one of them, and they wound up shooting each other, and they both died as a result. So that was the end of Soapy Smith, an extremely colorful character up there in the Yukon, but before that, a colorful character in the West in general. And he showed up, or at least an actor playing a character based on him showed up in this classic Western, or perhaps we should call it a Northern, starring Jimmy Stewart, the far country. The character based on Soapy Smith was played by John McIntyre. So here you could follow Jimmy Stewart and his sidekick Walter Brennan as they head up to the gold fields. And you know that this is a legitimate outlet for aficionados of the West and for Westerns when you consider that even John Wayne got in on the action going north to Alaska. North the rush is on. Well, Mr. Frederick Jackson Turner, maybe we can't go west any further, but we can go northwest, and that was a frontier region in the late 1890s, early 1900s. And beyond that, there's going to be another way by which the United States is going to continue to expand westwardly and other directions as well. But it's going to start in a very different climate, geographically speaking, not politically speaking, than Alaska. And that, of course, is Cuba and the USS Maine, an American ship which exploded in Havana Harbor in 1898, giving rise immediately to cries of "Remember the Maine" as a rallying cry and later a battle cry. Historians are by no means certain that this was something intentionally done by the Spanish, and in fact are pretty certain it wasn't. Actually, it was probably an accident, a random accident, but it provided a casus belli, a cause for war for those who wanted to go to war with Spain. And why would someone want to go to war with Spain? Why? To take away their possessions, something that the U.S. had actually been on the verge of doing or considering doing with Cuba back in the 1850s and into the 1860s. So, from the perspective of some, probably sincerely, and others much less so, no doubt, the goal here was to liberate the people of these various islands, the people of Cuba, of course, but also of Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines, to liberate them from Spanish rule. And to be honest, to be fair, the people of those islands had, in many cases, been trying to liberate themselves from the Spanish, and they didn't really mind a little help in that regard. But there were some in the United States who whose perception differed somewhat, kind of watching the drumbeat to war, which was accelerated by the yellow journalism of the day, the jingoistic, sometimes highly exaggerated headlines that were gearing people up to a frame of mind for war with Spain. Some of those onlookers tended to say, hey, I think we're actually trying to liberate the sugar trade from Spain. And certainly, a lot of truth there as well. Anyhow, this did lead to a war that wasn't a long war, but it has echoed through American culture as well as U.S. history. And it resulted, spoiler alert, the U.S. won, resulted in the U.S. taking possession of all of these islands, most of them in the Caribbean, but the Philippines a hemisphere away in the Pacific Ocean. Now, the most famous and easily recognizable thing about the Spanish-American War was the participation of Teddy Roosevelt, who, as you probably know, volunteered to raise a regiment of cavalry to come over that he called the Rough Riders, mostly cowboys, a lot of them from Arizona. And so they were involved in the famous charge up San Juan Hill at the Battle of San Juan Hill in Cuba, as portrayed in this painting somewhat inaccurately, because the fact is they had not quite managed to get their horses off the ships. So, other than I think Colonel Roosevelt, nobody had a horse. So this is actually a more realistic portrayal of the charge up San Juan Hill. And here's something that a lot of folks don't know. The Rough Riders were not the first ones to charge up that hill. They were the second wave. The first ones to charge up the hill were the 10th Cavalry, alias the Buffalo Soldiers, the all-black regiment of cavalry, who got really next to no recognition for their participation in this battle. They took heavy losses, being the first ones up the hill. Anyhow, here was the ideal opportunity for Teddy Roosevelt to live out his masculine, idealized, westernized dreams of being a rough rider, leading a group of other wild and woolly rough riders into battle. And this brought him in a big way to the attention of the world, really, and led to his celebrity status. Now, as we've mentioned, Roosevelt had a strong affinity for the West for a long time, having written that history of the winning of the West starting in the colonial period, but spending a lot of time in the actual physical geographic West. And, as a younger man, he had gone out and worked on ranches and actually got himself a job as a deputy sheriff for a short time and bought a ranch in Dakota Territory. And for a while, he divided his time between New York City and that Dakota ranch until it was wiped out by the blizzards of 86 and 87. So it's not surprising that, actually, I'm going to say that it's surprising that this whole scenario has not been played out more often in movies than it has been. But there was a film that came out, I think, in 1999 that specifically dealt with Teddy Roosevelt and the Battle of San Juan Hill, called Rough Riders, starring Tom Berenger as Roosevelt. And to give them some kudos, they did actually show the Buffalo Soldiers and their involvement in the whole thing as well. But to get back to the big picture, remember when I said that the U.S., as a result of this war, took over all those Spanish possessions, which might not come as a surprise to you, but it did come as kind of a surprise to the people of the Philippines, who had actually requested assistance to overthrow the Spanish because they wanted to have their own country back. The Spanish had been in control of it for centuries, and the assumption was that with the Spanish gone, they could declare independence and elect a president and have their own country. And they set about doing just that until the U.S. military informed them, no, you're not. We are in control here because you are incapable of administering your own affairs. So we're going to do it for you. And this did not go over well with the Filipino people. They had been fighting against the Spanish for some time, so they just switched over from that to fighting against the U.S. occupiers now. Now, the Spanish-American War only lasted a couple of months roughly. The Philippines part of it lasted much longer. Now, this is often referred to in older history books until just recently, like this century, as the Philippine Insurrection, which is a term that I never liked because it implies an insurrection, that someone is rising up against an established authority or a proper authority, and that's not what they were doing. They were trying to maintain the independence that they had just declared and hold on to their country. So now it is much more accurately referred to as the Philippine-American War. And by most accounts, this war lasted about 3 years, from 1899 to 1902, except that in the southern islands, the resistance continued much, much longer after that, 11 years after that. So really, the whole thing did not wind down until 1913. So think about this. The U.S. military came in with a huge defeat of the Spanish Navy at the Battle of Manila. Came in as liberators, and instead they are now fighting the very people that they said they were liberating, and fighting them in some very extreme ways. The U.S. military in the Philippine-American War used a lot of things that would now be considered torture or even illegal. They also started the practice of rounding the people up and concentrating them in camps so they would not be able to give aid to the insurgents who were fighting against the U.S. occupiers. And in some cases, they destroyed entire towns. A lot of civilians were killed. It was a very nasty and long drawn out situation that went on for years and led the people on the home front in the United States feeling a little bit frustrated, especially when word started coming back about the types of activities that the U.S. military was engaged in there, which a lot of people were shocked by and which a lot of people disapproved of very strongly. This led to the formation of an organization called the Anti-imperialist League, because this certainly seemed like what was going on, that the U.S., rather than holding on to its Republican principles on which it was founded, was now in the business of taking over colonies and building an empire, much like the other powerful countries in Europe had been doing and were still doing. And for a lot of Americans, this seemed un-American. The very basis of the country had been those 13 colonies being tired of being colonies, right? And after the country was established, it was established that there would be no colonies, that when an area had enough people, it could become a territory. And then when that had enough people, it could become a state equal to all the other states. But now, suddenly we're in the business of colonizing other people and building this empire. And the people of the nation were kind of split on this, because some were all for it. Some wanted to get a piece of the pie, get in on the action, and prove just how exceptional America was. Others believed that it was more important to remain true to the principles on which the country was founded, and found all this behavior problematic. So the Anti-imperialist League was established, and there was a celebrity that wound up being the vice president of this organization and the principal spokesperson, the face that the public saw talking about these issues, and that was Mark Twain. Mark Twain was very much opposed to what was going on in the Philippines, also very much opposed to American involvement in China in the Boxer Rebellion at that same time, when the United States had joined in essentially with a bunch of European powers and even Japan to send troops into China. And this eventually led to a public outcry against the occupation of the Philippines and to congressional hearings, because there were investigations about this cruelty being shown toward the people who were now being essentially colonized. But like I said, not everybody was anti-imperialist, which brings us to this guy, Rudyard Kipling, who was very pro-imperialist. Of course, Kipling was not American. Kipling was British. And yes, we're talking about that Kipling, who had written a lot of, and would write even more, famous works, many of them popular children's literature, that if you step back and take a look at them, are all about places that Britain was colonizing. And he was all about colonizing. He was all about building empire. And he strongly encouraged the United States to get in on the action, to, in fact, not give sovereignty and autonomy to the Filipino people like they were demanding, but to administer their country for them, for their own good. And it was in 1899, at the beginning part of that Philippine-American War, that Kipling wrote this poem, whose title has become a part of the national history, The White Man's Burden. And the point of this poem is about the Philippine-American War. The point of the poem is him encouraging the U.S. to join Great Britain and the other European powers to assume the burden of responsibility that white people have because they're so superior, and everyone else is savage and uncivilized and inferior. So therefore, as the more enlightened and civilized people, it falls to the white countries, essentially, to bring civilization to those benighted folks, whether they knew they needed it or not, for their own good, because those people don't know what their own good is. I'm going to put up some of the verses of this poem. I'm not going to put up the whole thing. You can easily find it online. Just kind of hit some high points. So here is Kipling encouraging America to take up the white man's burden, to send your sons forward for the good of the people you're going to take captive. Out there, these sons of yours, in weighed down by their weaponry as they administer things for their new caught sullen people that are half devil and half child. Why are they so sullen? Why? Because they don't understand or appreciate what the white man is doing for them by coming and conquering them and setting them up to become civilized. And as hard as the white man works to try to accomplish this thing, why those childish heathens with their laziness and their foolishness just mess it all up. And they don't even appreciate all that the white man is doing for them. They're just bitter and they complain. And yet, we do it anyway, despite that, because we do it out of a sense of duty, because we are the civilized ones. And it is our role to so slowly, because they are resisting the whole way, and to be honest, they're not that bright, to bring them into the light of civilization. And here's a political cartoon from the time demonstrating what we're talking about. There's Uncle Sam and his buddy John Bull, the mascot of Great Britain, carrying on their backs all these people of color, you will notice, and carrying them up this rocky hill toward civilization. And see how poor old Uncle Sam is groaning with the effort. It's Herculean, and my, isn't he noble for making this effort, even though they're up there just sort of like laughing, having a good time, as if they don't know what a wonderful gift is being bestowed upon them. And here is another political cartoon showing a different perspective, a slightly different message in this one, as it shows who the cartoonist believes the burden is really falling on. This one, by the way, is from Life magazine in 1899. The other one was from Judge magazine. But let's look at another illustration. Let's look at this one again and stop for a moment and realize that this whole situation in the Philippines, as well as in Cuba, really, it's manifest destiny in action, except it's not the manifest destiny going just westward, but now it's spreading across the waters, westward to the Philippines, southward to Cuba and to Puerto Rico, and etc. But it's the same idea. Those benighted savages in that darkened land that is being taken from them for their own good by the fair-haired lady of the West, by America, by progress incarnate. And she is therefore bringing them the gift of enlightenment. So not that much has changed other than the physical location. So this is one of the reasons that I would argue that there is a bit of process involved here. We're no longer talking about the American West, but we're still talking about the expansion of the United States over indigenous peoples. In the 1912 election, when the Moro peoples were still resisting the U.S. military in the southern part of the Philippines, Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic nominee, was elected president. So he would have been sworn in, I think they were still doing it in March instead of January at that time of 1913. And he appointed as his Secretary of State this other guy, William Jennings Bryan. Perhaps you remember him from our discussions about the Gilded Age. So Bryan had gotten the Democratic nomination 3 times, 3 different presidential elections, and lost every time. So now at least he has a steady job. Bryan was very much an anti-imperialist. He was also something of an isolationist. And he and Woodrow Wilson are not going to get along that well. Let me tell you a little bit about Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was born and raised in Virginia. He grew up to become a history professor, and eventually, by 1902, had become the president of Princeton University, which is in New Jersey. In 1910, he was elected governor of New Jersey, and he had been in that job for a couple of years when he successfully ran for president. Now, during the presidential campaigns, when William Jennings Bryan had been the candidate, in the lead up to choosing a candidate, Wilson had not supported William Jennings Bryan because he thought he was too far to the left. Wilson, still a progressive, was a little closer to the center than many of his rivals. In fact, in the 1912 election, it was him versus William Howard Taft, the sitting Republican president, versus Teddy Roosevelt, who was back to try again in a third party, the Bull Moose or Progressive Party, and then also Eugene Debs, the head of the Socialist Party. And Wilson was the most conservative, closest thing to a conservative of all of them, though, like I said, he had some very progressive policies. Wilson was also very religious and could be kind of parsimonious. And he had kind of a similar attitude toward democracy and the spreading of democracy as he did toward his faith and the spreading of it. I suppose some people might have described him as self-righteous or holier than thou. And he had a very strong missionary tendency where democracy was concerned. Now, he's going to accomplish some really good things as president, don't get me wrong, but his approach to the things that I just described are going to come into play in how he deals with America's neighbors to the south. Now, Teddy Roosevelt had been very much an interventionist in the Western Hemisphere. He was constantly getting involved in things in Central and even South America. Wilson is going to continue that sort of general policy. And at one point, he expressed frustration with someone who had been democratically elected in one of the Latin American countries. And he said, and this says a lot about him, we will teach them to elect good men. So, in other words, they don't know what they're doing, and we need to show them how to do it right and correctly. Now, the reason I'm talking about this stuff, we're about to discuss some situations along the border with Mexico during the Wilson administration. The reason I'm talking about this is that A, it comes into play with sort of the general perception of the American West, and B, it also comes into play with the whole manifest destiny idea, except now it's manifest destiny kind of by proxy. So during the Spanish-American War and afterwards, the U.S. is expanding into the Caribbean, expanding into the Pacific Ocean, and we're going to see how Wilson gets involved in some things that sort of follow that template and this overall overarching theme that we've been looking at. So let's take a look at Mexico for some context. Now, you might remember Benito Juarez, who was the president of Mexico, first elected, I think, in 1857. He was president during the American Civil War. He's the guy that had to contend with that French-installed would-be Emperor Maximilian that led to a civil war in Mexico at around the same time the U.S. was having theirs, and we discussed all this in, of all things, the gunfighter video, because we were talking about Ben Thompson's role in all of this. So Juarez resisted Maximilian, fought against the French, held on, remained in control in Mexico, regained control. And so now we're going to get caught up. Juarez had a lieutenant, well, he wasn't literally a lieutenant in grade, a general named Porfirio Diaz. And actually, Juarez had been his law professor. Diaz had, as a much younger man, so he's in his 30s during this Civil War we're talking about. As a much younger man, he had been part of the military that had overthrown Santa Anna. And he had also been in command of some of the Mexican forces in that Battle of Puebla, which is where Cinco de Mayo comes from, where they had that big victory over the French. Well, he's a Juarez guy, and Juarez remains in power. But within a few years, 1872, when Juarez's term was up, he declared he was running again for re-election. And there was there was a feeling in some quarters that he had been president long enough, and Diaz was one of those quarters. So he started a revolution against Juarez, his old professor, actually. And he started the rebellion in 1872. Juarez passed away in office in 1873, and he had another guy that sort of was his vice president that took over, and Diaz overthrew him. And by 1876, Porfirio Diaz was now the leader of Mexico and remained so for 34 years. There were no elections for a while, and then after that there were elections, but they were a sham. Diaz would always win by huge margins, even though most people didn't vote for him. Imagine that. That's the sort of thing that happens in Russia nowadays. Anyhow, finally, in 1910, one of these elections where Diaz, who's now a pretty old guy, he's been around for decades, many decades, is having a presidential election, which everyone sort of knows ahead of time he's going to win, and it is an election where a lot of the regular people support his opponent. His opponent was this guy, Francisco Madero, who was just extraordinarily popular with the people, and who did, in fact, get the most votes in this election. But Diaz refused to recognize that and threw him in jail instead. And from jail, Madero called for his supporters to rise up in revolution, which they did. And two figures are going to arise from this, two military figures who are going to play a very large role in events in Mexico over the next several years. Pancho Villa, Francisco Pancho Villa, Pancho is being like a nickname for Francisco, and also Emiliano Zapata. So Villa was a general. Zapata was kind of like an impromptu. He was called the peasant general. He was very much a populist as well, and extraordinarily popular with the people. So they led the opposition to Diaz to install Madero onto into the position that clearly he deserved because he had won it. And so Diaz is overthrown and Madero is put in charge. Well, that didn't last too long because one of Madero's other generals, a guy named Huerta, decided, hey, I'd like to be in charge. So he overthrew Madero and killed him and also his vice president, and now he was in charge, which did not make Villa and Zapata very happy because they were loyal Madero supporters. So when another of Madero's officials, Venustiano Carranza, decided that he's going to make a move now against Victoriano Huerta, Villa and Zapata supported Carranza to get rid of Huerta. So now, at this point, Emiliano Zapata is leading the peasant armies in the southern part of Mexico, and Carranza's two top generals are Pancho Villa and this guy, Alvaro Obregón, against the forces of Huerta. Are you with me so far? I know this is very complex, and it gets even more complex, but you'll see how it all ties in, if you haven't already, by the fact that we have introduced Pancho Villa in a short time. All right, well, let's take a look at this guy, this very non-Mexican guy, Henry Lane Wilson, who was the American ambassador to Mexico. He had been appointed by Republican President William Howard Taft, I think around 1910, 1911. The new president, Wilson, who had just been inaugurated, had left him in place as ambassador to Mexico. Wilson did not know that the other Wilson, by the way, they're not related, Woodrow Wilson, Henry Lane Wilson, President Wilson, and Ambassador Wilson. President Wilson did not know that Ambassador Wilson had actually conspired with Victoriano Huerta to coordinate the assassination of Madero and for Huerta's ascension to replace him. Nor did he know that Ambassador Wilson had negotiated a deal with the Germans, a German company, a German munitions company, to send a huge amount of weapons to Mexico for President Huerta's army to try to put down Carranza and the others. Wilson did, shortly upon coming into office, learn about Ambassador Wilson's role in the death of Madero, although it couldn't be conclusively proven, but it was enough to fire Ambassador Wilson. But you've now got this big shipment of German arms coming to Mexico, and there's a lot of tension between Germany and the United States, and Germany and the allies in Europe. The war hasn't started yet, so far as World War I is concerned, but it's getting close. And President Wilson views this, rightfully so, as a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, which says that European countries are not allowed to meddle in the political affairs of the countries in the Western Hemisphere. Teddy Roosevelt, by the way, had added what's called the Roosevelt Corollary to that Monroe Doctrine. That corollary, that addition being, but we can, right? This is our neighborhood. We can patrol it, but no Europeans. So anyway, President Wilson, not very happy about this arms deal. Now, the munitions are being delivered at the port city of Veracruz. So President Wilson decides that he's going to send U.S. ships down there to Veracruz to unload a bunch of United States Marines to prevent these munitions from being delivered to the Huerta government. And that's exactly what happens. They show up, these American ships, ahead of the arrival of the German ships, unload a bunch of U.S. Marines, without, of course, the people living in Veracruz knowing anything about what's going on. Now, what they do know, the people of Veracruz, is that in the U.S.-Mexican War, 1846 to 1848, which resulted in Mexico losing a huge chunk of their territory to the United States, and they know that when the fleets of Conquistador Hernan Cortés arrived to destroy the Aztec Empire around 1531, they landed in Veracruz. So, what the people of Veracruz know is that when boatloads of white people show up unexpectedly, it's usually not good news. And that's exactly what happened. And so the people of the city sort of mobilized to defend their city against what they thought was an American invasion. And it turned into a huge firefight. And a bunch of people got killed. A lot more Mexicans got killed than U.S. servicemen, but there were casualties on the U.S. side for sure. And incidentally, this guy was part of all that. He was a U.S. Army captain. Now, what's an Army captain doing among a group of Marines being landed by ships? Well, he was part of Army intelligence. His name was Douglas MacArthur, and he actually performed admirably under heavy fire in occupying a position during this fight, and was put up for a medal for it until people realized, wait a minute, he was given a direct order not to do that thing, and he did it anyway. Which tells us a lot about Douglas MacArthur, who, as you may know, is going to later be the Supreme Allied Commander of the Pacific operations in World War II and later be involved in the Korean War. Anyhow, this was a disaster. It was a disaster for the United States in that it really inflamed the anger of the Mexican people against the U.S. More so than it might already have been. And then when it was learned by the Mexican people that Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson had played a prominent role in the assassination of their beloved President Madero, then it made them even more angry. But essentially, what I'm saying is that Woodrow Wilson did not look before he leaped and created a bit of a mess here. But Huerta did not get his German weapons that he was counting on. And the constitutionalist forces, that's what the followers of Carranza were called, the followers of Huerta were the Federalists. The constitutionalist forces had a rebound. So you can see in this map, the dark green are areas that Carranza's people controlled as of January 1914. And then all the green stuff, including the light green, is what they controlled by June of 1914. And by the middle of July, 3 months after that Veracruz disaster, Huerta resigned and Carranza took his place as president. And here you can see a photo of Carranza's top two generals, Pancho Villa and Obregon, along with the U.S. military commander, General John J. Pershing, alias Black Jack Pershing, who is eventually, by the way, going to be the Supreme Allied Commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, not Supreme Allied Commander, commander of all the American forces in World War I. Now, Villa, Zapata, and I think even Obregon believed that Carranza should be the interim president until there could be elections and somebody different could be chosen. But Carranza decided, I want to be the permanent president, which led to some problems and actually led to Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata breaking away and now resisting him and rebelling against him. Obregon remained loyal to Carranza because both Obregon and Carranza referred to Villa and Zapata as basically criminals and peasants who couldn't be trusted. But in fact, they were both beloved by the Mexican people, especially, at that time, and maybe even more so since. Now, by December of 1914, the forces of Villa and Zapata had taken Mexico City. So he's on the verge of winning in his effort, that is Villa, to overthrow Carranza. Now, bear in mind that Carranza has defeated Huerta in mid-July of 1914, about a little less than 2 weeks before World War I started over in Europe. Now, here's something that's noteworthy. Carranza had been very anti-United States in his rhetoric. Not surprisingly, perhaps. And Pancho Villa had resisted publicly doing that sort of thing because he was hoping for support from the United States. So you would think that the U.S. would support him, not the guy who was bad-mouthing them, essentially. But apparently the U.S. government wanted to make sure that no one group consolidated power in Mexico to keep Mexico weak, particularly since there was a war brewing that could involve everybody. So the U.S. gave their support instead to Carranza, not to Pancho Villa, which he took very, very personally. Perhaps in retaliation for that U.S. Betrayal, which it could be looked at that way by Villa, or perhaps even more likely in an effort to entice the United States to invade Mexico and put them at odds with Carranza. In March of 1916, Pancho Villa led his forces across the border and attacked the town of Columbus, New Mexico, killed a couple of dozen people, and then went back across the border. Pretty quickly, the U.S. Army was mobilized and sent into Mexico, commanded by General Blackjack Pershing. And there was some limited success, I suppose, in what Villa was trying to do, if that was his goal, because this did lead to armed conflict and attacks between these army forces and the forces of Carranza, but they also were chasing Pancho Villa, and they had some engagements with him as well over the course of that, basically that year. And Villa always managed to escape from them, but there was some attrition setting in as more and more of Villa's men were being lost in these efforts. So here's General Pershing leading his troops into Mexico. You'll notice that by this time, the U.S. Army has completely abandoned the blue military uniform thing, which would, from the time of the American Revolution all the way through most of what are called, quote unquote, the Indian Wars of the 19th century. The U.S. Army soldiers dressed all in blue. In the Spanish American War and the Philippine American War, they had blue jackets but had moved on to khaki pants. Now they're just all khaki. And so here they are, pursuing Pancho Villa, who was, like I said, he was suffering from some attrition, but at the same time, he had a lot of support from the people, as did Zapata, still to the south. And here's an American political cartoon from the time of Uncle Sam hopping the fence and crossing over into Mexico to chase Pancho Villa, who's being portrayed as a barefoot peasant. And you can't probably see, it's probably a little blurry, but Uncle Sam is saying, "I'm getting tired of this." So here he is chasing Pancho Villa. And then here are some of those U.S. soldiers that are in this punitive expedition, which the whole thing went on for about, like I said, about a year. And I made a comment about the change in uniforms. Bear in mind, we are now in 1917 at the end of that year. And hey, do you know when the United States entered World War I? 1917, later in the year. And do you know what U.S. Army soldiers were called in World War I? World War II, they were called GIs. World War I, they were called doughboys. And no one's entirely certain exactly where that term came from. But one theory is that that nickname came about just a few months before the war in Europe was joined by the United States, when the U.S. Army was chasing Pancho Villa around the border and into Mexico. And they were riding through a lot of these alkali flats, and the alkali dust that would come up from the ground, particularly when a large number of horses were riding through it, would cover them until they looked like they had been covered in flour. And maybe that's where the term doughboy came from. Also, it is worth mentioning that the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the two Buffalo Soldier Cavalry regiments, were also part of this operation. Here are some 10th Cavalry troopers right here. So during this time, Villa and his forces are operating along the border, and they are sometimes still coming across the border and attacking the U.S. They had a couple of other raids, none of them as big as that first one. And so, how did that ever get resolved? Well, I suspect that the United States government found it embarrassing that they had not defeated Pancho Villa after chasing him around for a year. So in January, the order was given to Pershing to withdraw from Mexico, come back to the United States, and let Pancho Villa be Carranza's problem, basically. And by February, that withdrawal was taking place. Around the same time, the infamous Zimmerman telegram is a thing that happened. That was a telegram from Germany to the German ambassador in Mexico that was authorizing that ambassador to meet with Carranza and try to get Mexico to come into World War I on the side of the Central Powers, which was Germany and their allies, against the Allies, Britain, France, etc. Considering the fact that the United States was edging closer to joining in with that war, although there was a lot of resistance among the American public because most Americans were isolationists at that time. But the deal that the German ambassador was authorized to offer to Carranza was, if you'll declare war on the United States and we win the war, when it's all over, we'll see to it that you get back a big chunk of that territory that the U.S. took away from you in that war in 1848. Carranza actually considered this and decided that's probably not the right course to take because the U.S. was pretty powerful and there's like a civil war going on in Mexico at the time. But the whole goal of the Germans was to keep the United States occupied so that the U.S. would not enter into the war in Europe by actually coming to Europe. But the problem is, for the Germans, this telegram, this message, got intercepted by the British, who decoded it and delivered that message to the United States. And beginning of March, it was leaked to the American press exactly what this telegram had consisted of, and that changed public opinion overnight about fighting Germany, making a lot of people feel like, well, you know what, let's go do it. So that's all going on as the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa is ending. And, in no time, or not no time, but within a few months, Black Jack Pershing had other things to worry about, other fish to fry than Pancho Villa. So let's have a quick recap for those keeping score at home. In 1872, Porfirio Diaz led a rebellion against Benito Juarez, and Juarez passed away a few months up to a year into that conflict, and then he was replaced as president by Sebastián Lerdo, who was overthrown by Diaz, who then stayed in charge for 34 years until he was overthrown by Madero, who stayed in charge for a very short time before he was assassinated by Huerta, who was then overthrown by Carranza. And that's where we are right now in our story. In 1920, Carranza was overthrown, assassinated by his general Obregón, who then became the new president of Mexico which was an office he held until 1928. So there you go, 71 years of Mexican history summed up in like 90 seconds. When Obregón took over in 1920, he offered amnesty to Pancho Villa in return for Villa staying out of politics. So, just stay out of my way. But he didn't, really. In 1923, Pancho Villa was assassinated. And so that was the end of Pancho Villa. But like I said, a populist hero to many Mexicans then and still today, particularly a sense of pride in that not only his involvement with the Mexican Revolution, but his taking the fight to the Norte Americanos and never being defeated by them. So Pancho Villa has shown up in a lot of Western films, and here are several of them. You'll notice that he's been played in Hollywood films by several people. He's being played by Yul Brynner. He's being played by Telly Savalas. Finally, in the 21st century, they decided to have a Hispanic person play Pancho Villa with Antonio Banderas, which is actually a movie within a movie. It's a movie about the making of the movie that was made about Pancho Villa during the Revolution by Hollywood in 1914. And even Emiliano Zapata got in on the action in Hollywood. He was portrayed by Marlon Brando in a film directed by Elia Kazan and written by John Steinbeck. Here's a map showing all the U.S. military interventions and actions in Latin America from 1895 up until the 1930s. And as you can see, there's a whole bunch of them. It seemed that the U.S. military was always involved in something in these what were referred to, not in a complimentary way, as banana republics, that the U.S. was always involved in some conflict, sometimes several conflicts at once, which led the great Cherokee humorist Will Rogers to make the observation in the early 1930s. He said, I saw the strangest thing the other day. I was walking down the street and I saw a United States Marine actually in the United States. So, that looking at that map, you can see the basis of that joke. And so, because I am the master of subtlety, let's look at this picture again. This further demonstrates the manifest destiny type of thinking and attitude that was still operative in the U.S. government and among the U.S. people, where at least the Western Hemisphere was concerned, and as we've seen, also into the Philippines, and that's something that's going to be expanded on later on. So, Frederick Jackson Turner says, can't go any farther west, but then lo and behold, we did, and north and south, continuing this expansion and continuing to have very similar approaches and similar philosophies in how it was being done to the way that it was done in the 19th century, particularly post 1830s, in that whole manifest destiny era. I want to say just a little bit more about what was going on along the border during the time of the Mexican Revolution, which is essentially the 19 teens. In addition to Pancho Villa's military forces operating along both sides of the border there, and making raids. There were other groups, other bands of Mexican revolutionaries who were active, and there were sometimes rustlers, bandits, so forth, leading to what some people have called the bandit wars along the border. Here's a group of Texas Rangers. I think this picture is from 1910. Texas Rangers patrolling the border area during this time period, and frequently shooting people that were accused of rustling, for instance, or of being dangerous revolutionaries. And sometimes maybe they were, but a lot of times they weren't. A lot of times this was a hair trigger time for Anglos along the border where Latinos were concerned, and that led to this time period being called by the Chicanos, the Americans of Mexican descent, as well as people in Mexico, La Matanza. La Matanza is the period from 1910 to 1920, and that word means massacre or slaughter. So a lot of people of Mexican descent, maybe they were Mexican citizens, sometimes they were American citizens, were being just sort of randomly shot down or lynched by groups of Texas Rangers and by Texas militia, and sometimes just by random groups of white Texans. Sometimes also, this term is used, hora de sangre, for the period from 1915 to 1919. That's the period after which Carranza had come into power. Hora de sangre, or the hour of blood. There were, well, it's really impossible to gauge. At minimum, it's estimated 300 people of Mexican descent killed along the border on the U.S. side of the border during those few years. But that's a conservative estimate. The number could go into the thousands. And this is the most infamous incident from that time period. Happened in 1918 in the tiny town of Porvenir, which is along the border on the Texas side. But it was a little town that was, I think, entirely populated by people of Mexican heritage. And a company of Texas Rangers, and this is the very company right here that I'm talking about, although this photo was taken in 1919. A company of Texas Rangers, along with a company of 8th Cavalry U.S. Army troopers, came into the town of Porvenir looking for revolutionaries / bandits who had raided across the border. And according to the U.S. Army, the 8th Cavalry Detachment went outside the town and left the Texas Rangers in charge. There has been some doubt cast on whether that actually happened. They may have actually still been around for this incident. But I think there were also some people there that were not Texas Rangers, that were ranchers there from the area. But essentially what happened was they separated out 18 men and boys, Latino men and boys, from among the population of the town that they had rounded up, and took them up on a hill with no evidence, and opened fire on them and shot them until they ran out of bullets, and then just rode off and left them there to be found by their relatives when they went looking for them later. This is an incident that most Anglos in Texas never even heard of, but that a lot of non-Anglos in Texas have heard of and have not forgotten, which is along the border on the Texas side. But it was a little town that was, I think, entirely populated by people of Mexican heritage, and a company of and for a lot of people of Mexican heritage along the border, this has permanently colored their perception of Texas Rangers in particular. Although there were plenty of reasons and incidents for that before, because the Texas Rangers were also mobilized as military units in the U.S.-Mexican War, which is the time during which they got the nickname from the Mexicans, Los Diablos Tejanos, or those Texan Devils. So definitely this is kind of a very unpleasant and very ugly echo of other things that were going on at the time in the United States. There's a lot of lynching that went on in the 19 teens, but it wasn't all African Americans. And also just kind of an echo of the attitudes toward and feelings toward people of Mexican descent by a lot of the Anglo settlers who came into the area, and then later by this time, their descendants. Switching gears a little bit and jumping forward just about a decade or so, the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, which is something that we have discussed in considerable detail, like I said earlier, back in that lecture video about land policy. We talked about the situation there and how and why it developed the way that it did, and the effect it had on the farmers in the affected area. And then here is the affected area, the area of the plains where a lot of the soil just blew away. So we won't talk about that specifically now. I'll refer you back to that earlier lecture. But I do want you to pay attention to the area that was most affected. Now, we did also talk about Okies and the fact that most of the people affected by this were not in Oklahoma. That name just got applied to them and it stuck. And a lot of those folks migrated westward to California, where they found that it was not the golden state that they had dreamed of, because folks there didn't want them showing up looking for work. But I want to look at this in context, in connection with something else that we've already talked about a couple of times, and that is the romanticizing of bank robbers again during the Depression. Now, these guys here, guys and gal, these are the most famous of the bank robbers from that time. Now, a lot of folks get bank robbers and gangsters confused, and they think that Al Capone should be in this lineup of robbers. He was a different type of robber. There was, it was an organized crime, but he wasn't just like, a lone or small gang operating bank robber like these folks were. Most of their activity was in the Midwest or the West. Not all of them were from that area. John Dillinger was from Indiana originally, and he operated mostly Indiana, Illinois. Didn't go out onto the Great Plains that much. Machine Gun Kelly was in Memphis, but he moved out and started operating in Kansas and Oklahoma. Babyface Nelson was a northern bank robber. Also, I think from Illinois, active in Illinois, but who operated in the Midwest. Pretty Boy Floyd, most of his robberies were concentrated in Oklahoma, Kansas area. Bonnie and Clyde were from Texas, and their first several robberies took place in Texas, but later they they robbed places in Kansas, and actually a couple of these individuals wound up even up into Minnesota and Wisconsin. And Bonnie and Clyde met their demise in Louisiana. My point is that, as I discussed earlier, there's a connection, I believe, a very strong connection between the poor economic situation of the 1870s after the Panic of 1873 and at the height of the Gilded Age and the Great Depression, particularly in the Midwest and in that central area of the West, among farmers who were very, very frustrated at the banks and at the powers that be, and were therefore willing to cheer on outlaws. Whether we're talking about the James Gang and the Dalton Gang and so forth, or if we're talking about the Dillinger Gang or Bonnie and Clyde. And much like the James Gang and the others that we mentioned, these folks were not Robin Hoods. They were very violent people. Bonnie and Clyde in particular. Pretty Boy Floyd, not so much. I'm not aware of any evidence that he ever killed anybody. But I think that them arising when they did was obviously a symptom of the Depression, and particularly in this region of the Dust Bowl and the Depression at the same time. And the reaction that people had to them, the response to them, was also a unique aspect of that time and place, which had a lot of echoes from 50 to 60 years before this. So I believe that that the story of Bonnie and Clyde and Pretty Boy Floyd and so forth are made of the same cloth as the stories about the James Gang or the Sam Bass Gang or some of those others. They're still, I think, Western in nature, even though it's not part of a frontier at that time. Well, I want to take just a couple of minutes to talk about a couple of specific Texas Rangers from the time period that we're now talking about, starting with Frank Hamer, who joined the Texas Rangers when he was 22 years old in 1906, which means that he was active during that Matanza period, and had a very long career, a long and storied career of over 40 years, during which time he was wounded 17 times, not all at once. He is best known for being the guy who led the manhunt for Bonnie and Clyde and their gang in the 1930s, and who finally tracked them down in Louisiana and led the group that killed them, which actually they had found that there was a secret spot where they picked up mail, kind of out in the woods, and so they waited for them there. And when Bonnie and Clyde stopped in their car to check the mail, they were machine gunned in their car, essentially, and shot a gazillion times. And you could look at that in one of two ways. You could look at it as, this was an ambush, and some people would regard it as a cold-blooded murder. But also, Bonnie and Clyde, I think, had killed 9 police officers and were very dangerous. So, two different ways of looking at it. The definitely the way that you have to ultimately acknowledge is they wound up dead. There was a movie about Frank Hamer and the search for Bonnie and Clyde a few years ago called The Highwaymen, starring Kevin Costner. as Hamer and Woody Harrelson as his sidekick. Now, the other guy I wanted to look at is Manuel Gonzalez, who was the son of immigrants from Spain. They immigrated from Spain, I think, to Mexico. Maybe it was to the U.S. Anyway, he was a major in the Mexican army when he was younger, joined the Rangers in 1915, and had a very long career as well, very long, and over 30 years. He is most known, well, two things. Number one, he was the guy that led the manhunt for the Phantom Killer, who was an early serial killer, I think in 1948, in the Texarkana area, which is right there on the Texas and Arkansas border. This is one of the first serial killers to get a lot of press in the United States. He went around and attacked young couples at lovers' lanes and stuff while they were making out. Kind of the basis for a lot of slasher movies in the 1980s and later. And they never caught him. He was active for 10 weeks, in which time he attacked 8 people and killed 5 of them. This got a lot of press, though, and got a lot of exposure for Captain Gonzalez, who then went on to become a consultant for Hollywood films. And that's one thing he was known for. The other thing was just his nickname, Lone Wolf Gonzalez, because he followed the old Texas Ranger dictum in the 1920s of one riot, one ranger. So there was a lot of rioting going on in that time period, and that nickname, a Texas Ranger named Lone Wolf, maybe you've heard of that before. There have been several iterations of that in the movies, and it's all kind of loosely based on him, even Lone Wolf McQuade. And Ben Johnson, the Western movie actor, played him in a film called The Town That Dreaded Sundown, which was about the hunt for the Phantom Killer. This is one of those occasions that you didn't see that often by the late 1970s. You saw it all the time before that, where a non-Latino actor was cast in a Latino role. But at least they didn't change his name in the movie. So these two guys perhaps are 20th century, could be considered 20th century echoes of some of the lawmen that we looked at earlier. And it is noteworthy that, if you knew the history, if you knew about La Matanza and what was going on in the 19 teens, you would understand some of the troubling flashbacks that Kevin Costner as Frank Hamer was having in that movie. So they didn't specify it, but at least they hinted at it, which at one time would not have happened even to that degree. Since I'm on the subject of popular culture, I would like to make a recommendation to you for a story, a fictionalized story that covers a lot of the things that we've talked about today and in this class. It's a novel called The Sun by Philip Meyer. It is really an outstanding work. It was made into a miniseries that was 2 seasons long, starring Pierce Brosnan, called also The Sun. It's one of those literary westerns, and I'll be talking about that genre next time in our final lecture. But essentially, it's the story of a guy from Texas, a native son of Texas, who as a teenager was captured by Comanches and then raised by Comanches, lived among them for a long time, then later became a Texas Ranger, and he was a hard and ruthless man, and eventually became an oil tycoon and the richest man in Texas by about 1920. And the whole point of of the narrative is that his real story is a lot more disturbing and complex than the sanitized legend version that everyone knows. So, depending on how you like to consume media like this, I highly recommend you read or watch it. And this is a good segue to that final lecture because I'm now going to shift gears and talk about the West in popular culture in the 20th and 21st centuries and what it says, what the genre of the Western says about us in the United States as Americans and also people in other parts of the world who have attached themselves to this mythos. So this is the conclusion of the primarily historical part, and I just wanted to sum it up, to summarize it. So, end of the 19th century, early 20th century, the end of what is called the traditional Western period, or the Old West, or the Wild West. After that, after the Depression, I think, maybe I say after World War II, when you're looking at the history of the West, even if it's, like the Bundy family that we looked at earlier, you're looking at the history of a region rather than a mythos and its development. And so that's where we have, that's the point we've reached. Now, we'll have some final thoughts about all of it at the end of this next and final lecture.